What does it take for a professional hockey player to go from being completely abandoned by the league to holding the Stanley Cup over his head, while the executives who cast him aside watch in absolute silence from the press box? In the multi-billion-dollar business of the National Hockey League, players are often treated like depreciating assets on a corporate balance sheet. General managers and scouting departments pride themselves on their cold, analytical objectivity. They measure wingspan, body fat percentage, and straight line speed. But in their obsession with physical metrics, they often overlook the one variable that cannot be measured on a spreadsheet: human will. When a front office decides a player is useless, they do not just cut him, they strip him of his identity. Yet, some athletes use that humiliation as rocket fuel. This is the story of the cost of rejection, a deep dive into how the league's most arrogant decisions created its most unstoppable champions. To understand why NHL teams make catastrophic evaluation errors, one must understand the culture of scouting. For decades, the league operated under a heavy bias towards size. Executive rooms were dominated by traditionalists who believed that hockey was a game of attrition that could only be won by giants. If a prospect stood under 5 feet 10 inches tall, he was immediately red flagged. Scouts would write reports claiming these smaller players would be broken in half by physical defensemen, that they could not survive the grueling 82-game schedule, or that they were defensive liabilities. This systemic bias created a blind spot. Teams repeatedly drafted taller, less talented players simply because of their frame, while ignoring elite, highly skilled players who happened to be shorter. It was a comfortable safety net for general managers. No one ever got fired for drafting a 6'4" defenseman, even if he could barely skate. But this cowardice came at a massive price. In the late 1990s, Martin St. Louis was rewriting the record books at the University of Vermont. He was a 3-time finalist for the Hobey Baker Award, given to the best player in college hockey. He possessed a level of hockey intelligence and leg strength that was objectively superior to almost everyone in North America. Yet, at the 1997 draft, 26 NHL teams stared at his height, 5 feet 8 inches, and decided he was invisible. Not a single team used one of the 262 draft picks on him. Undeterred, St. Louis clawed his way into the professional ranks, eventually signing a minimal contract with the Calgary Flames. But the organization treated him like an unwanted guest. They buried him in the minor leagues and gave him scrap minutes when he was called up. In 2000, Calgary hired a new general manager who wanted to make the team tougher and heavier. He looked at St. Louis and saw no future. The Flames bought out his contract, making him a free agent. At 25 years old, Martin St. Louis was told by the hockey world that his dream was over. The Tampa Bay Lightning were the laughingstock of the NHL in the late 90s, which was the only reason they had the roster space to take a chance on a discarded 5'8" winger. They offered St. Louis a low-risk 1-year contract. It was the only offer he received. In Tampa, St. Louis found a head coach in John Tortorella who did not care about the draft pedigree or physical height. He demanded work ethic, and nobody worked harder than Martin. St. Louis transformed his disappointment into a relentless training regime, developing thighs so powerful they became legendary across the league. He became a human dynamo. By the season of 2003 to 2004, the player Calgary threw away for nothing was the most dangerous weapon in hockey. St. Louis led the NHL in scoring, captured the Hart Trophy as league MVP, and guided the Lightning to the Stanley Cup Finals. In a twist of poetic justice, their opponent was the Calgary Flames. In Game 6, with Tampa facing elimination, St. Louis scored the game-winning goal in double overtime, breaking the hearts of the franchise that had rejected him. Tampa won Game 7, and Martin lifted the cup, cementing his status as an icon. You would assume that the rise of Martin St. Louis would have permanently changed the way NHL executives evaluated talent. It did not. The sports world is stubborn. Front offices often suffer from cognitive dissonance. When a small player succeeds, they treat it as an anomaly rather than a flaw in their scouting philosophy. They labeled St. Louis a unicorn to excuse their own failure to scout him properly. The fear of making a mistake still guided decision-making. If a general manager drafts a small player and he fails, the manager is criticized for ignoring physical realities. If he drafts a giant who fails, the manager can claim they tried to build a physical team. This self-preserving cowardice in NHL front offices meant that the door remained open for history to repeat itself. And a decade later, another French-Canadian winger was about to prove that the league had learned absolutely nothing. Like his predecessor, Jonathan Marchessault was ignored by every single NHL team on draft day. He stood at 5 feet 9 inches tall, and despite scoring 95 points in his final year of junior hockey, he was deemed too small for the modern game. He spent years riding buses in the American Hockey League, playing for pennies, waiting for a legitimate opportunity. When the Florida Panthers finally gave him a chance on a cheap 2-year deal in 2016, Marchessault exploded. He scored 30 goals and proved he was a legitimate top-line offensive threat. Yet, behind the scenes, Florida's management was undergoing a structural shift. They were transitioning to a new analytical model and decided that Marchessault's breakout season was a fluke. They did not believe his success was sustainable. When the 2017 expansion draft arrived, Florida faced a choice on which players to protect from the incoming Vegas Golden Knights. What happened next remains one of the most baffling executive decisions in modern sports history. The Florida Panthers did not just leave Jonathan Marchessault unprotected for the expansion draft. They actually negotiated a trade with the Vegas Golden Knights, sending them another highly productive forward, Riley Smith, in exchange for a 4th-round pick. The condition of the trade? Vegas had to select Marchessault. Florida's management literally gave away 2 first-line wingers to a brand new expansion franchise just to clear salary cap space and protect a group of mediocre, taller defensemen. It was an act of profound arrogance. They assumed they were outsmarting the system. Instead, they handed the Vegas Golden Knights the identity and the motivation that would define their franchise. Marchessault packed his bags for the desert, carrying a chip on his shoulder the size of the Las Vegas Strip. In Las Vegas, Marchessault and his teammates embraced a moniker that became their battle cry, the Golden Misfits. They were a collection of players rejected, cast aside, and deemed expendable by their former employers. Under the glittering lights of Nevada, they found a shared purpose. Marchessault became the emotional heartbeat of the franchise. He was vocal, aggressive, and fiercely loyal to his new home. In their inaugural season, the Misfits shocked the world by marching all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. Though they fell short that year, the foundation had been laid. Marchessault was not a one-hit wonder. He was an elite NHL superstar. Year after year, he led Vegas in scoring, proving to the entire league, and especially to the Florida Panthers, that his 30-goal season in Sunrise had been no accident. But the ultimate cinematic payoff was still to come. 6 years after the infamous expansion draft, the universe presented the ultimate script. The 2023 Stanley Cup Finals featured the Vegas Golden Knights against the Florida Panthers. It was a direct collision between the rejected and the rejectors. For Marchessault, this was not just a series, it was a personal reckoning, and he played like a man possessed. While Florida struggled to contain his speed and intelligence, Marchessault put on a masterclass. He scored 13 goals throughout the postseason, including a historic run in the finals where he scored in almost every game. He completely dismantled the Panthers' defense, making their executives watch from the press box as the player they had given away for absolutely nothing destroyed their championship hopes. Vegas defeated Florida in 5 games, capturing their first Stanley Cup. At the conclusion of the series, Jonathan Marchessault was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy as the most valuable player of the playoffs. He stood on the ice as a champion, holding the 2 most prestigious trophies in hockey, while the team that had traded him away to get rid of him watched in absolute despair. The legacies of Martin St. Louis and Jonathan Marchessault are powerful proof of a simple truth. Professional sports are not played on spreadsheets. The scouts can measure your height, your weight, and your speed, but they can never measure your resolve. When the establishment tells you that you are not enough, it is not a definition of your limits, it is a reflection of their blindness. The cost of giving up on the wrong player is not just a lost trade or a bad season. It is the painful, eternal sight of that same player lifting a championship trophy in another uniform.